If you need some encouragement in the midst of this pandemic, stay tuned for an amazing story, and then go be an encourager yourself. For the Colson Center, I'm John Stonestreet. This is Breakpoint. Mr. Rogers used to say that in a time of crisis, we should always be looking for the helpers. Throughout history, in times of crises, Christians have been among the helpers, often leading the efforts and the innovation in order to bring relief and healing to victims. In the early days of the coronavirus crisis in Wuhan, China, for example, Christians were helping. And still today, American Christians are helping their neighbors. For example, when Reverend Charles Cheek of the Peninsula Baptist Association in Hampton Roads, Virginia, learned that local homeless shelters were closing on account of the pandemic, he and his church started a community donation drive to get food to those who are impacted. Another example is the Alabama megachurch, Church of the Highlands, who turned their parking lots into drive-through coronavirus testing centers. Within 2 days, nearly 1,000 people across the state had been tested for the virus in an effort staffed by 2 doctors and church volunteers in protective gear. This effort was not wholly unexpected for this church because since 2009, they've operated a health clinic that sees 18,000 patients a year. And then there's a remarkable story happening in my backyard. I mean it, my backyard. Not only in Colorado Springs, but actually about a stone's throw from my house. My friend Josh Imhoff and his group YWAM Emerge is being used by God to bless this community with lettuce. Thousands of heads of lettuce. As Josh told me on the latest episode of the Breakpoint podcast, YWAM Emerge works in 15 countries around the world, teaching orphanages, churches, widows' homes, and more how to grow self-sustaining food through aquaponics. Aquaponics is a system for growing vegetables that involves raising fish whose waste produces fertilizer for growing the vegetables hydroponically. The plants, in turn, purify the water for the fish, so it's sustainable. YWAM Emerge has sustained its ministry of training others in this practice through their own lettuce production. Their greenhouse produces 2,700 heads of lettuce every week, which, until just a few weeks ago, was sold to restaurants and colleges and other local ministries and businesses. But when the coronavirus hit and restaurants and schools had to close down, nearly all of their accounts were canceled within a few days. As Josh told me, quote, "We lost a lot of money." Fearing he'd have to shut down the whole operation and ministry, Josh went to God in prayer. Actually, Josh admitted in our podcast interview, he went in to cry and give up. As he prayed, Josh's mind was turned to Exodus chapter 4, where Moses was protesting this new job assignment he had gotten from God. God replied, "What do you have in your hand?" Josh told me, Moses had a staff, and I looked, and what we had in our hands was lettuce, a lot of lettuce. Josh became overwhelmed with this idea of giving the lettuce away to the community. We've been blessing other countries, he told me. It's time to bless Colorado Springs, to bring hope, to turn something bad into something good. Now, one of the most amazing parts of the whole story is how Josh and his team managed to pull this whole thing off in just a few days. Not only pivoting from business accounts to food distribution, but doing it the day after a snowstorm. Hundreds of cars arrived at the YWAM Emerge property to pick up 2 heads of lettuce, one for themselves, one to give away to someone in need. The YWAM staff were all there, hands washed and gloved, and in a socially distanced sort of way, encouraged people, took prayer requests, and served them lettuce. I would have elderly people driving in with their masks on, Josh told me. You could see the fear in their eyes, and so many told us, "Thanks for giving us hope." Now, of course, Josh doesn't think he can feed a whole community with lettuce. But this week, several churches will now be involved and will be serving their community, providing volunteers to help Josh and his team to encourage and pray for anybody who asks for it, some doing it kind of virtually online, all while picking up lettuce. And this has pushed the YWAM Emerge team to expand their operations so that when sales finally resume, they can continue to bless the community. Please don't miss Josh Imhoff telling this amazing story of how God is using lettuce to bless Colorado Springs. It's the latest episode of the Breakpoint podcast. Come to breakpoint.org to listen or subscribe to the Breakpoint podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or whatever podcast service you use. Look, sometimes being a helper is as simple as asking this question: what's in your hand? And when you come to breakpoint.org, sign up for a special webinar that will be hosted by myself with my special guest Ed Stetzer this Tuesday, March 31st, about how Christians are loving their neighbors during this whole coronavirus pandemic. It's part of our next online short course. Come to breakpoint.org to sign up. That's breakpoint.org. For Breakpoint, I'm John Stonestreet.